Hey, Alex.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good.
So, is this like the right time it was supposed to start, or did I arrive somehow early?
I'm just like 2 minutes early. I
Ah,
know. I
okay.
just talked to Mariana and Dan and a couple other people, and they're going to be joining any minute now. So,
Okay, well, I'm gonna mute myself for a while, but I'm gonna be here. I'm already connected.
yep, sounds good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey,
How are you?
good, good. You find a good spot for Wi-Fi?
I think so. At least for
Good,
now, it's holding out.
good. Yeah, so how's it going? You've been at work for a while?
Yeah, since like five. Hey, Michael.
Oh, hey. Hey, Mike.
How's everyone doing?
Good.
Yeah, not bad.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say can't complain. It's a pretty nice, cool day here, and yeah.
Nice. Yeah, we're starting to get warm again. It's like in the mid 80s, and I think it's going to be 90 this weekend.
Ooh.
So
Hey Brian, did I get that correct? That you have an Against the Day tattoo?
yes.
Nice. I
Oh,
love
do you?
Against the Day.
Yeah.
Me too.
I mean, I think maybe in history, in time, it'll be considered better than Gravity's Rainbow in due time.
I do too. Yeah, it's not very often anyone recognizes it, but a couple of times when I've been in a bookstore or something.
Yeah, I think I saw something on one of the social media sites. I was like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Also, Alex is here, so if anyone wants to, you definitely don't have to turn on your video or anything, but just wanted to.
Yeah, I'm just turning on my video, say hi. I'll probably turn it off for most of the reading as well.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we had a little bit of an issue. I feel kind of bad. I don't know if you saw the email chain, but so the announcement for this group we made last week when we had the reading of the Joshua Clover poem. We announced that this was going to be the same time this week, but I feel stupid. I didn't send out an email about it. And it was only yesterday that like the main mailing list got the announcement. So like Dennis, I know is not going to be joining, and I don't know if anyone else really would have had time to read it without knowing about it in advance.
It completely slipped my mind because I know we put it on Twitter ahead of time, and I thought we did an email, but then I checked and yeah.
Me too. I know. Yeah. So it was on Twitter for a few days. But yeah, I don't know who else is going to show up. So it might be a smaller group than we expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, I just found out about it this morning. Unfortunately, I had a pretty empty day, so I just read the text today.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Great. I'll be right back then.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, we can wait a few more minutes and just see if anyone else shows up. Maybe start at like, I don't know, 2:10 or something like that.
Hey.
Hey.
Hi. How are you? Good.
All good here.
Good. I was trying to get Rodrigo to join.
What's that background? I was trying to make out your background.
It's the Hydra.
Ah.
I'll send you the painting. The beheading of the Hydra.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm excited for the dissection of the essay though. It's gonna be good.
Me too. Yeah, I can believe I started and finished that essay today. That was pretty frenetic behavior. That's the painting.
Oh, cool.
Oh, okay. Oh, hey, Alex. Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe we met, right? Tal vez nos conocimos ya.
No, creo que no nos conocemos, pero hola.
Hola. Mucho gusto. How did you find out about the group?
By Twitter, I guess, but yeah, also like I'm very involved with people working in Chiapas and so on. So I actually don't recall if it was only from Twitter or from some mailing list in which someone recommended this space. So this is the first time I'm joining you.
Welcome. That's so great.
Thanks.
Hey, Ariana.
Hey, Ariana. Welcome. um, just wondering, like, I mean, welcome to the with the. Just wondering, like, how did you find out about the reading group and all of it?
Yes, on Twitter. I just through that I just emailed. Yeah.
No, that's awesome. That's so great. Welcome. Shall we begin, or should we get a little bit more for Leo
Yeah.
and Rodrigo?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of anyone else that's joining, so I could just start by introducing or saying a couple general things about the essay.
Yeah, I know Susanna can't make it today. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just say a couple words of introduction, since I don't know if I choose this. I think I sort of did, but anyway, yeah, so
No. Okay.
I think we might need you guys getting some bad background noise? Okay. Yeah, so this essay, first of all, Crisis and Immiseration, Critical Theory Today is what it's called. And I'll just say that it was published in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, which was edited by Chris O'Kane, Werner Bonefeld, and Beverly Best, and was published in 2018. It's a huge book that has, like a couple thousand pages of just contemporary scholars writing about the history of the Frankfurt School. And I think this essay is the very last essay in the whole book, which is kind of interesting. But the reason that I'm interested in it is because the co-authors, Beninav and Clegg, are two figures who have been deeply involved in the EndNotes collective for years. It's a editorial collective that publishes a journal called EndNotes. It was originally based in the UK, but Beninav is from the US, and it's sort of a international collaboration at this point. But they've published 5 volumes so far. The most recent one came out in late 2019. But it's sort of they call themselves a communist theoretical journal. They're very much rooted in sort of Marxist political economy, but also, I think bring it up to the present very well in a very sort of sophisticated way. And a lot of and we haven't read any. Oh, we did read Jasper Burns' Revolutionary Motives essay, and that was published in EndNotes 5. So I thought this one was a good introduction to their sort of way of thinking, more so than anything that's been maybe even published in EndNotes itself. This essay by sort of 2 central figures in the collective, it kind of just introduces where they're coming from, and it also kind of shows their rootedness to some degree in Frankfurt School critical theory, which that was another thing I liked about this essay. They kind of trace, the genesis of sort of dissident Marxism throughout the 20th century, show its strengths and its limits, and they then move on to talking about their sort of what they call their return to Marx, and they sort of just go through. I mean, we could go through each section. We could sort of work through each section sort of sequentially if we wanted to. But so the reason I chose it was sort of just as an introduction to this EndNotes perspective that kind of has been kind of a ambient background to the last couple, essays that we've read by Jasper Burns. I guess I don't have too much else general to say about it. I don't know. I guess we could start with some first impressions or something like that. Does anyone have any? It's a difficult essay, right? I mean, it really takes a lot of attention. I read it last night. I mean, I'd read it before, but I reread it last night, and I just felt kind of like my brain cells were totally expended afterwards.
Yeah, I read it just today, so I haven't really had too much time to formulate much thoughts on it. But I didn't find it too difficult. I find it moved along.
Yeah.
You know, there's you start with a bit of a history at first, and then later gets to some more theoretical stuff, and then closes out nicely with you know, kind of a going forward, looking forward. Here's, like you said, an introduction to our general plan and way of thinking. So. Yeah, I'm hoping to have some better comments just spontaneously come throughout the group talk, because I didn't even write any notes on it, just have a few highlights. But yeah, that's first impressions.
I think you suggested it back in 2020 or 2019, and now with such a different framework and like much I guess more bibliography added to my experience of like theory, it was such a different experience, just to examine the same content. And I was surprised with how from the get-go they just reject all those prejudices and like possibly incorrect understandings that one might have from the 20th century Marxist tradition. And just like, you know, they do it so succinctly and well. So that was a pretty refreshing thing.
Yeah, for me, it was, I really enjoyed reading this. It was quite difficult, and I think knowing endnotes and yeah, endnotes especially, and I think was helpful in navigating this essay. I don't know if it was a bit cheating, kind of recognizing their arguments, but it was helpful as a starting point. But I think, yeah, it will be exciting discussing in this group. So going beyond maybe what my preconceived ideas or what I was expecting from this essay. And I think there are quite a few points that that kind of broke new grounds with respect to what I knew, and especially the very final part, the conclusion and what the theory is about. But also other points, and maybe thinking those in relation to our contemporary moment that is different from 2018 when in 2019 before COVID, when I think I first read the essay as well. Yes, so yes, I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, one thing I could say, yeah, if it's, I mean, to continue where it follows from EndNotes, and at the beginning it also mentions the different schools of newer Marxist thought, including Neue Marx Lektüre, which I'm not too familiar with, but what I think I got was that something that's not really stated outright is that how it wants to separate itself from traditional Marxist thought is to get beyond the labor theory of value. I mean, which is never really named outright, but I mean, I felt like that this was kind of a helpful framework for approaching the essay, that this labor theory of value, which the traditional Marxist theorists simply thought Marx was trying to adopt from Smith and Ricardo and simply perfect, but that was the narrow reading, whereas really it was simply a kind of a tool to help understand his greater analysis of capitalism, and to propose something beyond value, which is kind of how this value reading group started. It was a labor theory of value and why it's, you know, insufficient or wrong. So, I mean, did anyone else pick up on that?
Yeah, that's a good. I'm glad you brought that up, and I was going to talk a little bit more. sort of their approach to crisis, I think, is more rooted in Capital Volume 1 in Chapter 25 than it is in Volume 3, which is where most people, draw Marx's theory of crisis from. But I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the crisis section. But yes, Mike, the Neue Marxlektur, there's a quote I wanted to read right at the beginning in the Topsy-Turvy World section. They say, this Neue Marxlektur interpreted Marx's theory of value through his discussion of fetishism, not as a theory of the determination of prices, but rather as a theory of the determination of social labor as price. Here, the dissidents drew on Sohn-Plevel's notion of real abstraction, in which the material life process is dominated by the abstract and impersonal social forms of value. I really liked that little part right at the beginning. The Neue Marxlektur was just a sort of a new way of reading Marx that grew out of some of Adorno's students in Frankfurt. I've talked about it before. Hans-Georg Backhaus is kind of the figurehead of the movement, but in that first section, what I liked is that he kind of he talks a lot about Adorno, and also he introduces some other sort of dissident, or non-orthodox Marxists from that period, and he talks about how they were all writing in a time. He kind of tries to historicize them, which is what I liked about this essay. He tries to show that they were writing in this period of the 1960s, especially of basically growth and stability and rising living standards for the working class. So they were critical theorists, but they were looking at Marx, and they were looking at these things like the immiseration thesis and the theory of crisis, and they were wondering, are these things simply outdated? Because nothing like that seems to be happening around us. We seem to be living in basically a stable sort of a stable world, but they turned their attention away from sort of the more political economic theories of immiseration and crisis, and they looked more at these other aspects like alienation, but more for Adorno, more particularly impersonal domination. So Adorno, there's an interesting essay he wrote in the late 60s called Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, and in that he says very directly, we have to put into question a lot of these classic Marxist concepts like the pauperization theory or the immiseration theory. He also says Marx's theory of surplus value seems to be called into question, and that gets to what you're saying, Mike, because the theory of surplus value is essentially based on the idea that human labor is what creates value at the macro level. And Adorno is saying, well, human labor plays less of a part in production with growing or rising organic composition of capital, but profits seem to keep going up. So he says we might actually have to call into question Marx's theory of surplus value. And this is in the late 60s. But shortly thereafter, in the 1970s, everything changes. And they get into it, this period of the period we still live in of stagnation, disintegration, and basically immiseration and slow crisis. So I liked how they were able to put the Frankfurt School sort of thinkers, especially Adorno, but also Guy Debord in France, and into this context of they were right, they were correct in what they were thinking in their time, but their time is different than ours. So we can't just uncritically accept them as the end story of their theory of capitalism.
Right, and that they hadn't yet lived through the period of deindustrialization and couldn't. I thought that was really interesting, especially early on, just to put it into context of each time we come to a new stage, a new it's good to be constantly reevaluating, and not that we throw out things from another period of time, but that we take that and find out where we need to adjust it, or where
I mean, also to connect to the turnover from productivity to stagnation, which started in the 70s. Maybe it'd be interesting here to mention in relation to Bananev's other work, his Automation in the Future of Work, which I haven't read it, but I've listened to him talk about it, so I'll try and just sum it up really briefly. Or his main thesis is that, I mean, people want to blame automation for the loss of for rising unemployment and stagnation, everything, because they're looking at a very, very short-term scale from the last 20, 30 years. He says when you look at the same stats including from the 50s to now, it's actually overproduction and shrinking markets. And so, yeah, so which I guess is a, I don't know, it's a crisis of demand maybe, but so that it's, automation is not necessarily this thing that's going to, pauperize or create massive unemployment. It's, we have to produce more and more and more to keep up with capital accumulation, but markets to buy the world markets are simply shrinking. I mean, or shifting in ways, because if we look at, how much China as a market, as a consumer market is, really affecting production and not only production, but even cultural production as well. But yeah, that's running off on a tangent. But yeah, so just to, to introduce that Ben and Ev contribution to political economic history going into this, I thought is useful.
Definitely, yeah, and yeah, he comes out of the sort of Robert Brenner reading of mid-late 20th century economic history. I think Robert Brenner was his dissertation advisor, and yeah, you summed it up pretty well. I think that yeah, so yeah, his recent work on automation, and in EndNotes too, he talks about how automation has happened to some degree, like the fixed capital base that produces most of the consumer goods for the global for global consumption. The organic composition of capital did get pretty large by the 1960s, so it didn't take too many people to make all of the cars for the world, for example. There's just a few countries that produce all of the automobiles for the whole planet. And similar with other things, machine tools and all kinds of industrial equipment. And so that the process of automation did and deindustrialization did take place, but in the present, we're not like on a trajectory where everything's good, right? Like you said, we're not on a trajectory where everything's going to be automated, because first of all, like with labor being so cheap these days, with such a global oversupply of labor, there's really no reason to automate a lot of things. It's like only in certain industries does it make sense, and yeah.
Well, and I haven't read it, but just watched a couple of different interviews with him. Isn't another thing he brings up a lot that it's not so much that automation like suddenly got rid of a bunch of jobs, but that it changed the way we work, how it took people away from the point of production, and how it like more augmented people's work rather than, right? And I don't know, I've always worked like physical labor jobs and been around it, and like that's definitely something you see. Not necessarily that people lost their jobs in mass, but more that they were no longer doing the physical work. They were more learning how to run the machine and managing and stuff like that.
Yeah,
right, and also the massive boom in service sector jobs, which is part of this paper that we have to kind of, we can't continue thinking, not that many of us do so anymore, but we can't keep thinking of the factory as this category of the workplace anymore. The factory and the factory worker. But also one funny line in terms of like, is automation going to take over our jobs? There's one funny article I once read, and especially in like knowledge economy jobs, that they're not going to take over your job, they're going to become your managers, and I work and I have to work for some of my jobs using software that manages me and how I work and how I write. So, but yeah, that's beside the point.
Yeah, no, I'm on the automation aspect and the expectation that technology would lead to progress and to free time, which would allow for the class consciousness and awakening for organizing, mobilizing. I mean, he says here, right, like that, as you mentioned, that the 1960s lived in an epoch marked by superabundance of goods and just general splendor. But what I found really interesting was just that no free time would come with that. And even then, people would work such long hours, but also a new issue was added, which was that they were no longer under salary or wages, and they were mostly like working in informal industries. So the concept that you were defined by your identity as a worker, and that's what would make you suddenly revolt, was not longer a quality, right? Yeah, sure. Oh, okay, all of them are. Yeah, interesting. I mean, that part, that globally that was a phenomena, and that most people work informally today or are not even part of the working class, that are of the surplus population. Do you want to cover that then?
Yeah.
I just want to jump in and just say, but I kind of felt like throughout the paper, he's urging us to no longer think of, the working class as this sole means of identification in terms of, quick, spontaneous, temporally located forms of gathering organization. I mean, it is one, but not to depend on it so much. It's kind of the feeling I was getting from the text.
Totally. He says, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it says, at this point, it is critical to reiterate that the decline of the classical workers' movement has not meant the dissolution of the working class, which I thought was very precise.
Yeah, and the thinking about the workers' movement is a big part of sort of the EndNotes research program, and I would say it's especially in EndNotes 4 is when there's a big essay called A History of Separation, also co-written by Benenev and Clegg, where they just discuss the rise and fall of the workers' movement. And yeah, exactly like you just said, I think I've said this before, but like the working class has a wider extension than the industrial working class, and then the proletariat has an even wider extension than both of those. And so like in the period of deindustrialization since the 70s, the industrial working class has shrank drastically, especially in the kind of capitalist core countries. But I forget how much they talk about that in this essay, but in another essay, they talk about how even in places like China, where people kind of imagine this kind of booming industrial society, like China hasn't added any industrial jobs since like the 90s. They've been deindustrializing too. And it's really just a result. And yeah, so and I think someone else commented on this. So there's one crazy statistic today: informal work accounts for 1/2 of all non-agricultural work worldwide. Yeah, oh, and one other quote I was going to read that I thought was interesting. So they say on 1632, since the early 70s, economic stagnation has been accompanied by deindustrialization. Factories continue to produce more output, yet they employ fewer workers, worsening the deficit of labor demand across the economy. As a result of deindustrialization, the growing free time of society is not only something to be actualized in a future socialist society, it's also actualized within capitalist society as enforced idleness for many and as overwork for the rest. Yet the problem workers face under these conditions is that even if their labor is no longer needed, they cannot stop selling their capacity to labor. So like the idea is that the society is still based on the kind of a big picture here. The society is still based on everyone's primary social link to society is essentially still has to be based on work. That's the way your labor input to society is the way that you obtain a wage to then buy the means of consumption. But society has become so much more productive since the 1960s, where it takes very few people to actually produce the things that we all need. So everyone else still needs to scramble to sell their labor power, but there's just less productive enterprises that need them. So there's this huge informal service sector that grows up, which ranges, from people, doing freelance, gigs in sort of the capitalist core to like people selling kebabs on a street corner in wherever. That like just basically people doing whatever they can to make a pittance in a society where the fixed capital base is so productive that it just makes many people surplus for the needs of capital. So that's the idea of the surplus population. And there's different grades. And Marx introduces that term in chapter 25 of Capital, by the way. And that's kind of what I said. Ben and Evan Clegg, their crisis theory kind of comes from volume 1, not volume 3. And by the way, volume 3 was written before volume 1 for the most part. Volume 1 is kind of Marx's final statement, in case anyone didn't know that. But yeah, Marx talks about these different grades. There's the relative surplus population, the stagnant surplus population, and then there's sort of the lumpen proletariat, which is at the lowest rung of the ladder of the pecking order. But yeah, that's the basic idea of the surplus population.
Alex, do you have something?
Yeah, like listening from the things that you've been sharing, I was just wondering about all of these ideas of the factories and understanding that this text and its author, like they are situated like in the global north and so on. I was thinking about like all of the conversations we're having with people who work in the maquilas. I don't know which is the name for this in English, but which are like these factories in which people actually handle very sophisticated technologies and devices, but they don't actually know what they're fabricating or how to operate the things they're fabricating. So I believe, well, for me, it's really like mind-blowing to know that there are people working these really precarious jobs who are also being exposed to very high dangers to their health through the fumes they're managing while they're operating these little parts of the technologies they're building. And at the end, all of these technologies are the ones that are used in the global north to sell the idea of progress and automation, and everything is so tech like aligned or something like that. And I don't know, for me, it's like really interesting to see like all of these dreams that are being reinforced also by the academia and these great thinkers on how technologies could actually help you have a life in which you would have all of this free time to be, I don't know, much more intellectual, much more politically inclined or so on. And at the end of the day, most of those dreams basically come at the cost of more precarization and more exploitation from the people of other parts of the world, which are not so, that don't have the possibilities to share how all of these dreams of the capital impact them. So, well, that was one part of it. And the other part of this, which I was like just thinking about when you were sharing all of these quotes and the reflections on the quotes of the text, was this part of these discussions that are being held among sex workers regarding sex work as a form of anti-work. Because at the end of the day, most of the jobs that are offered in these really creepy gig economy are most of the times, sell with the idea of you can be your own boss. You can decide which times you have to work, which times you have for like doing whatever else you want, and you can have a somewhat decent life and decent work pay. But at the end of the day, that's not true. And most of the people who defy these work models, even though they are these cool techie work models, are most of the times being like criticized and openly attacked by the state and its policies. And this is seen as, for example, with all of the issues in the United States regarding FOSTA SESTA and how many sex workers actually started using some technologies to share their work or reach out to more clients, or even with all of this COVID situation. Lots of people, especially like young women and people from the LGBTQ community worldwide, started using platforms as OnlyFans to actually make a work pay. I maybe that's not the right way to phrase it, but like a living wage, something like that. But at the end of the day, as these platforms as OnlyFans are ruled by what's going on in the United States, they have to subject to what happens in that country. And people from many other countries that are not in the best interest of what's going on in the United States and its government end up being, once again, precarized or even directly harmed by these abusive policies. And I'm bringing this up because even though I know we are not talking about OnlyFans and specific United States policies, this is also kind of reinforces my point on how many of the conversations that are being held regarding the future of work, the future of political organizing through technologies, or even like the future of our human rights on well, facing the relationship with our liberties and rights have to technologies end up being just very global north based. And at the end of the day, yeah, I believe all of this is quite interesting to understand and to know and relate, and also with the understanding that this was a reflection that was shared some years ago. It was not even like near to this time and age. But yeah, I think that it's also very important to come back, and if we have the capacity to have these conversations in which people from different parts of the world can join and share, I think that it's like really cool to have this possibility of learning about Marx and all of these great thinkers, I guess. But I think it's also interesting to see how in this day and age, these ideas or these ideals or dreams of a capital are affecting the way in which people are also trying to make a living outside, or maybe in the margins of that technology-driven dream, which is actually not working for everyone. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That really gave I think a lot of just like body to, and just more substance to just kind of giving some flesh to this idea of like service, what service work is today. Yeah. Also, the thing that you said at the beginning, I found very interesting about the maquillas, just the idea that people are working in these workshop, in these maquillas, putting stuff together that they don't even really know what it is. And it brings us back. I mean, some of you weren't at our last discussion when we read, or last two discussions, we read another theorist named Jasper Burns, but he writes a lot about this, just kind of like the global logistical system, and how like more and more it's about, it's not about like everything's made in, you know, one industrial base. It's like something's made there, then it's shipped somewhere else, and it's like something's done to it, and then it's shipped somewhere else. And it's this process that's, in Marxist terms, really subsumed, as opposed to just being formally subsumed. Talked about these terms, but what it means is that like the workers themselves have no epistemological or practical tractability for what they're doing. What they're doing is fully externally designed and imposed. They don't even, yeah, like you said, they might not even know what they're making. They're just one node in a huge global logistical network. And that's becoming more and more the case. People have less and less epistemological and practical tractability in this chain of production. But yeah, that just got me thinking. That was really interesting. Oh, Ariana, please.
Yeah, I think connecting what Daniel said about surplus population, the importance of surplus population in this essay, and what Alex said, I think, so what it got me thinking about, and what Daniel said after Alex, in relation to what Alex said, I think how, so the ways in which we try and achieve, we try and connect, so build on and overcome this unity and separation, trying to avoid the mediation by the structure within which we are placed under capitalism. So thinking how this connection between peoples in different countries, how we can think beyond the connection through being part of these chains and flows, productive chains and flows. And instead, this discussion about surplus, the expansion of different forms of surplus population, which is exciting for me, especially even, you know, in a COVID, post-COVID moment where this expansion is very real. And all the time throughout COVID, they talk about essential workers, that rhetoric kind of reaffirm that identity of the worker as something positive, while, as Alex says, beneath that there is violence and lives that are lost in many different ways. So thinking about how it is as surplus populations that we can disrupt these flows of production, and we can connect disruptions in different ways. And it was especially in relation to two externalities in a way, to the existence as workers. So as opposed to which they mention on page, I think, in the struggle section. So I think it's on page 1637. So connecting, working towards sidestepping of antagonisms and division between workers on the basis of an externality to the existence as workers, which reminded me, which what Alex said reminded me of, as something a bit different from categories external to the mode of production. So it felt that it was slightly different, but so thinking the idea of an expansion of forms of surplus populations in relation to those two externalities, so organizing external to our existence as workers on the one hand, and then categories external to the mode of production. I think it's slightly different, and the discussion around surplus population and what Alex was saying about life beneath, beyond, and above our existence as workers, I think was really interesting.
I don't want to jump to the end, but this reminds me of something he said briefly about the right-wing populist reaction against two things: bankers, the personification of surplus value, and refugees, the personification of surplus populations. But I guess we'll maybe come there. But yeah, that was really interesting, and always good to be reminded to put it in the larger context.
Yeah, I like that. I like that passage. Yeah, these are all really good points. I feel like Ariana, what you said about kind of, so they start getting like, I guess towards the middle of the essay, they start getting into like the question of struggle and the question of if there's no such thing really anymore. I mean, there's still industrial workers, but they say the industrial workers no longer, like, we can't think of it as like the avant-garde of some working class movement that's eventually going to be so unified and homogenized across the world that it's going to be able to just, something's going to just click over and it'll be able to take control of the means of production and produce for use value rather than for profit. They say that that's certainly not the case anymore. There still is a huge global working class. There's also just this massive surplus populations who work in all different kinds of, I think service work is kind of an annoying term, but I don't know what else to use. Just services, because it kind of just flattens like what Alex was talking about, like, people that depend on OnlyFans is very different than someone working in like, corporate marketing or something like that, but they're all classed as services. But anyway, so if there isn't this working class identity based around the industrial worker anymore, if the workers movement is kind of dead, well, we have this global surplus population. Under what predicates or categories or identities might they unify? And what strategies and tactics might they use? Well, they say that so far one major tactic is blockading and stopping the flows. That's kind of a theme that EndNotes has been interested in for years. Stopping the flows of global capital. But they say that so far there have been some good, methods of blockading around the world, but there has yet been no breaking into the zone of production itself. So you can we can blockade things, but no one has thought of tactics or strategies of how to break into that zone of production itself. It's still an external kind of external action. Does that make sense? And that for a full, for a revolutionary communist movement, or a process of communization, you would have to figure out how to break down those walls to get, not get into and run the factories as they currently are, but figure out some way to, produce for necessities, and not just be not just sabotage and block.
Yeah, what you just said, I highlighted a part that basically I kind of says what you were saying. Maybe I could just read it.
Yeah, please.
Page 1637. Well, it's two separate. It starts off with, if the categories of capitalist society, the worker above all, but also the factory, once appeared to be categories with a possible emancipatory content, that is no longer the case. And a little further down, they, I guess workers, do not achieve their real unity within the expanding space of the factory. On the contrary, the remaining factories, which continue to employ a minority of workers, here at least, are merely a manifestation of what separates all workers: commodity production and market exchange. Workers are thus compelled to find their real unity elsewhere as human beings, beyond the terms of a society that makes work the primary social link. And I think elsewhere there was a line about used to be the strikes and everything used to spill out from the factories, and then there was the metaphors like now they need to like break in, and you said that yourself, to use that break in, which reminded me of that. So yeah, I think that's one of the cruxes of this central part here, which one is called the reckoning, I think. Mm-hmm. Yeah, reckoning. Uh-huh.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for identifying that part, because I had forgotten about that, but that really feels like the crux of the whole piece. And so I think it's so helpful for thinking those issues about do we need to break into the space of production, or are we trying? I don't know what I'm saying, but I thought that point was so beautiful by itself, but also so interesting for thinking different ways of connecting and disrupting flows. I don't know, not necessarily. It really, in light of that passage, feels so difficult to think ways in which we would want to organize within at the point of production to disrupt flows. It feels that we need to reorganize elsewhere to attack capitalism. It feels just very difficult to make it fit organizing with at the point of production, that very point about what kind of social links do we want to build on to create a new world. It feels very difficult to confine that to the point of production, but I don't know what people think.
Alex?
So thank you. So also just adding up to what you're saying, and also when I was reading this part of the text, something that immediately resonated with me was the first civil disobedience on digital media that happened back in the 90s, late 90s. And for me, it was very funny because I put a link in the chat in which they explain more of it. But this was a virtual sitting, basically. And what reminded me of this was precisely this part of how can you disrupt the flows, how can you generate these blockades, thinking about how these spaces that at some point in history were mostly physical, now they're having also these digital presences. And even though I know this is not particularly digital related, as we were talking about technologies and so on, I was thinking about how this experiment or this first digital disobedience action was very powerful in the sense that it was not only connected to people knowing that some tech capacities or some tech tech inclined knowledge, but it was also like very much linked to the Zapatista movement and things that were happening here in Mexico when Cedillo was president. So in that sense, what they did was, I'm not gonna like dive into the technicalities of it, but they were capable of disrupting the flows of different sites from Mexican and the US government as well. So in that sense, for me, even though this might be only performatively and not like something that might have had a very big political impact or very big political, I think it was only impact what I wanted to say, but yeah, the idea is that they were able to actually make this happen. And I think that even though in this day and age, it might seem kind of complicated to convene or to create communities or to have organized actions, there is this part of the history which is not so accessible, in which these experiments are already being tested, like in some other parts of the world or at some other moments. And I think it's very nice or very like hopeful in a way to see that there are other possibilities to have these approaches, even though they're not rooted in these very critical or very like academically approach or philosophically approach perspectives. They are actually actions that people have started taking in or even experimenting with in order to keep on testing the political potential of the use of technologies when it is not linked to the production of profit or to the well-being of the capital itself.
Yeah, and building off that, something I noticed around like the time in the essay just after where Michael quoted, I was already going to comment on this, but it kind of ties into what you're saying. Like, I feel like they make the point several times. Well, so for one thing, they talk about that with the onset of deindustrialization, it marks the end of that cycle that they talked about. Every time that there would be like worker power, there'd be a technical transformation which would change the production process and change older models of worker organization, and they'd have to kind of like start over from scratch over and over again. And then they comment how like I think the Italian auto workers thought that it was all part of like a political conspiracy almost, but that the deindustrialization marks the end of that. And then they say that the one thing it does do is that the current age has so many more possibilities, right? Because when it was like the industrial age, you know, you could have worker strikes or you could have, but like the points were very limited, right? Whereas now there's tons of options. Like Alex was talking about, there's more like social media types and the one thing I noticed with them is they seem to not be dismissive, but like to somewhat be like, yeah, those things, but you know, they're all short-lived. Like it seemed like they brought that up multiple times, and that's true in some sense. But I think, like Alex was just saying, like the one thing it does do is it gives kind of hope, right? Like when you have these actions, and sure, it might not like completely disrupt the system or it might be temporary, but it also gets people's imaginations going over like what's possible, right? I don't know that we need to have it'd be great, but I don't know that we need to have like some super organized like mass plan to overthrow everything, or if these little chipping away do make more of a difference. I don't know. Anyone?
Yeah, I think that's similar to stuff we were talking about with Jasper Burns as well, is that, you know, we have to
Right.
kind of decommit to this idea of a one plan, of a one goal, of a one trajectory, you know, of a series of quantifiable metrics to see how well you're doing. And and just constantly allow for, you know, new spontaneous possibility. And the more disruption happens, even if it's small, it's the more opens up places for that. I mean, there's at one point in this text on 1638, he just says, taking out of context, that a large scale disruptive action is risky. He goes to say it's also really, really hard to do, but you know, the riskiness of large scale disruptive action is twofold. On one hand, it is, you know, you'll still need some productive capacity to keep things going if there is going to be a massive revolution. Still, you know, basic needs need to be met, and don't want to destroy infrastructure. But it's also the commitment to the idea that it's large or none, which is also counterproductive, because it, you know, it could lead to defeatism and inertia, and, you know, further alienation.
Sorry, I think I missed like the concern, or like the fact, what was the part that did not present itself, like, or manifest in the essay, that you had an objection in general? Like, is it like the way in which is not like encouraging massive like ways
Well,
to
no, it wasn't. I don't.
no,
I,
in
think
like in
I
general.
wasn't taking object. I wasn't objecting to anything in it, but yeah,
Yeah.
just like with Jasper Burns, it, you know, the focus should be well, there should be no like faith in you know, singular big plan, big goal type of ideas, because those are usually
Yeah.
missed or co-opted, or, you know, it will take more than that.
Right. No, I agree. I think it was really interesting in the way when he brings the theory of atomization, and the way in which we have been separated in the workforce, right, as different manifestations of the things in which we differ from what's the normative perspective of what the worker could be. So we're just an accumulation of like prefixes in our identity, because it's still like an idealist and non-material way to define us, and our identity is still limited to that of the class struggle. So this has functioned for the benefit of the capitalists, because then the struggles are directed based on that specific real ostracized state in which we live. So we're not longer unifying, but rather kind of showing up for social movements as tribes, and there might be some cross-pollination in between, but it's clear that, I mean, that Zapatistas mentioned this as a common metaphor, right? The heads of the Hydra, and what we should be focusing on is the true materiality of the heart, that attack the heart, because these the patriarchy and the heteronormative conditions and the just exploitation, and I mean, I can mention all, right? They're all results of this patriarchal and pyramidal system, and I guess like that's what they are trying to address in just like that part, that people no longer want to, or never really did want to, identify with that which brings them the most sadness and the misery, right? The work, labor, like your labor, your time occupied by something that lacks meaning. But yeah, sorry. I don't know what to add to that.
No, that's, oh, so go ahead, Mike.
No, please go.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, there was a lot said there. I'm just trying to like, yeah, figure out what there's so much to address. I will say that this essay didn't concentrate. There was one section where they talk about, you know, different struggles, and they mention a few. They talk about the tactics of occupation and blockading and rioting, especially, which they say are more the tactics of our time, as opposed to, you know, the strike. Which strikes still happen. I mean, in India recently, there was that massive farmers strike. I think it was like the biggest strike in Indian history, something like that. But so it's not to say that strikes don't happen, but it's not really the hegemonic form of what manifests itself as rebellion against the system considered broadly. So yeah, in our time, these other tactics seem to be more prevalent. And I think about like the Arab Spring and kind of, Alex, what you were saying, just like the kind of you know, innovative uses of technology in certain kinds of social action. I think that was pretty important in the Arab Spring itself. They don't really address the Arab Spring in this essay, but there's a newer essay that came out last year. It's on the EndNotes website called "Onward Barbarians," and they do talk quite a bit about it and kind of its limitations. And another thing I wanted to address, sort of just getting to that point in the essay where they talk about the state and just sort of the rise of populism, and just how the political center of representative politics has kind of fallen out due to all these kind of macro structural factors we've been talking about. And there's the rise of the right populists and the left populists, and they're very skeptical of the idea that anyone's going to succeed in this, because they don't think that accumulation can really be jump-started again at the national level, just due to this, what Mike was saying earlier, this global overproduction problem, and this, which is correlated with a global dearth of profitable investment, because there's just, there's too much capital accumulated at the top. There's not a ton of purchasing power at the bottom. And there's just not too many things that can be productively and generatively invested in. Yeah, right, Mike. And so yeah, that aspect of the dealing with the state and in their skepticism towards representative politics in the present, but yet realizing that is kind of how, also what you said, Mike, just the forms of appearance, of surplus value in the form of the bankers, and of surplus populations in the form of the refugee and the immigrant, makes it very easy for the right to confuse people and mystify the real causes of all this. And so it's kind of a muck we're stuck in right now.
Yeah, and to get back to the bankers as the personification of surplus value, I wanted to talk a little about the parts where he talks about how we focus on crony capitalism. You know, so especially with the crisis of 2008, it kind of had a mystifying effect where it's like, okay, you know, the banks shouldn't have, the government shouldn't have bailed out the banks, should have bailed out the people, and you know, if we could have just had like, if we could have had more like just straight up capitalism where failure equals failure, and there's no bailouts, and bailouts don't shape, you know, tax and austerity policies to come, then that would be fine. But in the end, that would still just be preserving, you know, the value, you know, the domination of value form in capitalism, and then almost in focusing on like the worst elements of crony capitalism is also a distraction and an obstruction to, you know, a real beyond.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I definitely when I started get interested in the 2008 crisis, and you know, which was many years after 2008, yeah, it was really easy to get caught up in anger over the response to it, and get sucked up in that, and then realize that like, though if you're trying to imagine the right way to have done it, it's still going to perpetuate the system, maybe just make a softer, nicer system, but always just for a time, because those things don't last.
Yeah, and similarly with last year, with the massive intervention and coordination by central banks, particularly the Fed and the ECB and, you know, the Bank of Japan, the big central banks across the world, coordinating these massive stimuli packages. It's kind of like we live in a permanent situation where like the world economy is kept afloat by these periodic injections of trillions of dollars of money into the system. Without those, the system would be completely collapsing. But also with them, it's not like it's jumpstarting this big new economic boom. I mean, like there really a lot of it just stays up in the netherworlds of high finance, and it moves around amongst a very small number of hands and institutions and shadowy market actors up there at the top. So yeah, and they use the word of the Marxist term over accumulation to describe the kind of the situation we're in. And they say that so it's sort of like the crisis. It's both a crisis of the reproduction of the labor circuit, of the reproduction of labor power at a global level is disintegrating. There's less and less labor needed by capital. So there's more and more people that just have to fend for themselves as part of this swelling surplus population. But also at the level of capital reproduction, that's also not disintegrating in the same way, but there's too much money accumulating without enough profitable investment to chase. So there's too much money chasing too few investment opportunities, and it keeps interest rates really low, and it just keeps money, they call hot money, sloshing around the global economy. But there's just not too much activity. It's a sort of terminal stagnation that we've been in since the 80s, of not much real growth in the world economy. So it's those kind of two mutual crises, that kind of the disintegration of the reproduction of the labor circuit and the disintegration of the reproduction of the capital circuit, kind of we have to think about simultaneously.
Yeah, like also just like adding up on that, I was thinking about some of the previous reflections you were sharing about, specifically Julia was sharing on this part of decentralization in a way, because I think that what's happening also regarding capital and these economic stimulus to banks and so on has to do with the dependencies. And yeah, I know that what I'm saying is not like something that wasn't completely obvious to that point, but I believe that there is this constant reinforcement of the idea that in which capital is the only way to make life sustainable. And this also comes through because there has been a very powerful kind of propagandistic spread of how important it is to live in a city, to have all of these services and commodities. And at the end of the day, whenever you are trying to organize outside those ideas, it comes at a cost of these, like social participation in a way, because when you're trying to do all of these alternative ways of organizing or of having a sustainable life, you get like, it's like really, well, if you try to organize it in a traditional way, like saying what people do in Oaxaca with the tequios, for example, that has like some contextual side of it. But for most of the people who live in the cities, it's very costly to have a quote unquote sustainable life. So at the end of the day, you still have to depend on the state or on these services and commodities that are in a way managed by this relation between the economic powers, the state, and well, the banks and these very big industries, or you have to try to make best with what you can find. And it comes in a very high cost anyway. So I believe that maybe, thinking about what Julia was saying, trying to promote ways in which people can be organized that are actually applicable, or that you can actually build with people around you in the context you're at, could be a way in which you might, you might shift these power imbalances, but also like promote this critical thought in order to break with these dependencies that time and again, whenever there's a crisis, makes us think that the only way to survive is by keeping up holding the state and the capitalist structure.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well put. I mean, we've sort of we talked a little bit about this issue a couple reading groups back when we read Jasper Burns' Belly of the Revolution, where he was just talking about like, well, and some of the other sort of frequent people we have around here think about this issue a lot of like building autonomy in the present, you know, outside of the reproductive, you know, making autonomy means like autonomy of reproduction, which means like, you know, being autonomous with regard to the basic necessities of life, and not outside of the circuit of the wage commodity nexus or the state. And yeah, we've had some discussions about that here. I think that's always and that's going to look very different in no matter where you are. You know, it's very hard to have a single model of something like that that could just apply everywhere. It's very different in, you know, in Oaxaca compared to like Ferguson, Missouri, or something like that. But you know, that way of thinking, I think, is very important, of building autonomy in the present. I do think also it's important. I guess I'm personally skeptical of the idea that like revolution could ever be that happening in small pockets all over the world, and then we reach a critical turning point where it's just like that becomes more powerful than the capitalist state nexus. I think that there's gonna that unfortunately there's gonna be more of a cataclysmic. I have more of a cataclysmic image of you know, economic crisis combined with increasing social strife could kind of you know, not everyone's going to be converted to the revolution before the revolution happens. I think of it kind of in the process of revolution itself. People will realize that these things are inevitable, that they have to start producing food another way. They have to start not rely on the wage to purchase commodities, but have to start meeting their needs more directly. But it's not something that's going to be built like in the interstices of capitalism. It's something that's going to emerge in a sort of more cataclysmic revolutionary process. It's not to say we shouldn't try to build those autonomies in the present, but I'm kind of skeptical that that's ever going to like maintain a critical momentum and overcome capitalism just by creating another world within capitalism. I think there's going to have to be more of a cataclysmic break with it. Controversial take.
Oh, I think.
No, no, go ahead. Go ahead. I was just going to say that I think too, that it isn't just in thinking that, like, to me, that we'll have like so many pockets that eventually will overthrow. It's also like, I hate to say it, but like, thinking in terms of planning for like not a glorious revolution, but disaster. I mean,
Definitely.
Global warming is getting worse constantly. And so it might not be a communist revolution that overturns capitalism. It might be disaster. But even then, we need, you know, community, and we need to know how to take care of ourselves without capitalism, because that might be the option, or not even option. That might be the result too. I mean, I just worry it's going to happen sooner than any of us think, because even if it's not like you know, like a water world or something, just these small changes make massive upheavals. You know, I mean, especially in coastal places. You know, just look at like Haiti right now. I mean, you know, one more big storm and they're going to be facing massive upheaval like before anyone is ready, right? And I don't know, that was something that actually, I swear I brought this up like every time we've done one of these, but like in Minneapolis during the George Floyd, that's something a lot of people were talking about, was we need to be setting up these community, whether it's mutual aid but just like organizing even and getting to know our communities. Not just, I mean, obviously it'd be great if there was a grand revolution, but also to look out for each other when nobody else is going to. Because, you know, the first thing the state is going to ditch is us. The first thing they're going to not be looking out for is us. So anyway, they're going to be building their, you know, whatever island bunkers and shit like that. So anyway.
Yeah,
For sure.
Waterworld is a great movie.
sorry. But yeah, I think that also something regarding what Brian just said about yeah, this part of building these communities or even these actions that could in a way start building up communities around them. I think it's also very important, and I know this is also beside the point of this conversation, I'm really sorry, but like all of these lack of conversations about how do we build trust in these movements and communities comes at a great cost of the potential we can have in order to build those communities and movements. So yeah, I was also thinking of these ideas of we, the people, are gonna be the first thing the state or the capital ditches when things start like really getting critical. There's also like these, I think recently there has been more awareness on the psychosocial costs of facing this crisis time and again. And I think that it's not, yeah, there's like a very clear relation between these conversations on how do we build trust in order to create movements and organizing with our communities, and also how do we create this trust in order to help us heal each other or be present in the processes of healing other people have, because of course we have like all of these violence on behalf of the state, but there is also all of these violences that come from the disregard of the state, like all of these climate crisis manifestations and so on. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there.
I think that's an extremely important point about the aspect of building trust, and it's just so difficult because, I mean, it's again, it's one of those things that's very different in different places. So there are parts of the earth that still have communitarian modes of living sort of in place with you know, culture, practices, and the trust that comes from those things being shared kind of still exists, and it's being, you know, slowly you know, the asset of capitalist relations is slowly eating away at it, but it still exists much more than in places like where I live in the US. And you know, like it's not just the work process that's really subsumed, to use Marx's term. It's like the whole material infrastructure of daily life atomizes people. The apparatuses of the technology and the social media we use, it atomizes people. People are so atomized, especially in sort of urban metro areas, that that's a much more, yeah, it's a much more difficult question. It seems to be like people come together in certain moments, and but yeah, building trust and community is much harder, I think, in like a metropolitan, you know, capital in a metropolitan area in the capitalist core, as opposed to areas that still exist in communitarian bases.
Yeah, and speaking of the metro urban, you know, populations, and speaking of, you know, trying to build trust, especially bridging between, you know, different types of people, like to get towards the last page of the paper where he talks about you know, the intra-class divisions and we, you know, think of intra-class divisions, and he goes on later to talk about the specific small but often very vociferous group of the labor market, which are well, in the context of worsening labor market conditions, many workers with better than average wages and working conditions strive to protect their corners of the labor market, not only from the onslaughts of capital austerity, but also from other proletarians. So we know that crust of the workers, which, you know, I guess like technically I'm part of, you know, but they're they're often the ones who are a lot you know, harder. They're the ones who, you know, are really the big defenders of, we could just make this system a little bit nicer. And you know, they're often quite difficult to build any kind of trust and to talk to. I mean, sometimes you could talk to, workers in lower wage jobs and worse conditions from all walks of life. And at one point it's, you can kind of, find some common grounds, but this particular class of workers, there's a lot of names for them. The PMC is one of the popular names right now, but yeah, how do you build trust with this class, the ones who are just desperate to hold on to the bottom rung of the upper class, and will often be the discipliners of the, because they for a long time, they've dominated the voice of so-called like progressive movements or so-called leftist movements. They're the vocal ones. They were the ones to start the organizations and the magazines and everything. But they're also the ones who are starting these unicorn startups now at the same time. So, well, not the ones starting the startups are not working, I guess, but the ones who rush to join one of the latest hippest Zoomer-led startups with Taco Tuesdays and ping pong tables.
I think definitely, and I think in addition to like where you were saying, where a lot of that is like the PMCs or whatever, but another just anecdotal, but something, so like in construction, for example, a lot of the unions are really strong as far as getting like good wages, good medical or whatever, but they're also extremely conservative. And again, this is just one example, but I do think it bears out in a lot of different fields. So like carpenters, right? The ones who are the heads of the union are, they call journeyman carpenters. They've been doing it for 20 years, whatever. They make great wages, but they're almost like completely separate from people just coming in, right? They're not fighting for like their wages or anything. They're not concerned with them at all. And the people just coming in put up with it because their goal is to become the 20-year veteran, right? They put up with any kind of bad wages or anything because their goal is to get to that bottom rung, still not really in control of their own work. Mm-hmm. And they brought that up some in the essay about, or at least I interpreted it that way. I think they might have been talking more about like people with more secure jobs versus people who are doing like like Uber driver. But I think it also applies to within wage labor that, I mean, even in so many jobs I've had where we don't have unions, but somebody who's been there for a while is making $30 an hour. Somebody who just got there is making, let's say, like 15 or something. And they're almost like very competitive. The person working for $30 an hour is worried that they're going to get their job taken. They're going to be replaced by somebody younger. There's such tension between the two. And I don't know. I just, I think not only that people no longer like identify as workers because something else they brought up was how people see work as something you have to put up with, but not something you identify as. But I don't know if going back to that would even work now.
I think that's recurrent in the paper too. That the workplace has become so alienating, and that the spirit of competition between workers so entrenched that is the obstacle that prevents workers from identifying together as workers, because the idea of work has become so toxic in the head, that's been one of the problems. It's funny what you said about unions, that you said like, so unions in construction, you said they might be working for better wages or something. I'm not exactly sure, but so I don't have too much intimate knowledge of working with unions, but like I hear often that with a lot of unions in non-construction and in like, I don't know, service sector and government sector unions, that like the problem with them now, the reason why people hate them now is because they've kind of given up the goal of, you know, getting more and more worker control within the company, and now unions have become these internalized like culture monitors just to make sure that the work culture is fine and nice, and they've kind of just basically like become internal HR departments, which has been to the relief of companies because it kind of like lets them offshore some of those responsibilities. And so I don't know if that's a difference in construction. It's still the more the traditional union, where it's, you know, more and more worker control or worker rights or autonomy or just better conditions and wages. But yeah, I mean, unions don't simply, you know, there's a romantic notion of unions which I think doesn't really hold up anymore, at least not in the way I hear people talk about it who are involved in unions or writing about unions. And has anyone anyone seen it, like heard this or gotten this idea? I mean, like the Amazon union drive in the States failed. I mean, that failed for a lot of reasons, and probably and partly due to shady practices on part of the company. But that people, you know, don't see unions as you know, the real representative of true worker control and autonomy.
Total.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far out, but in answer to your question with construction, I mean, construction unions, they get good wages. That is, everything else about them is toxic as hell. And not only the fact that they consistently give mass amounts of money to Republicans as far as their political, also like their motivation is just existing homes to rebuild unnecessary high-rise apartments. I mean, they're totally not just complicit, but they're the ones pushing gentrification. So that's toxic and awful. But then also, they don't even serve a purpose of like really, you would never see construction workers strike, despite the fact that, and I think some of us had talked about this previously, how like there would be a lot of potential for construction workers to strike, especially because it would go across. I mean, if framers were to strike, other workers would be forced to join in because nobody else in the construction can work until the framing is done. Also, you can't really hire scabs. Like, anyways, it would be totally, at least effective could be. It would never happen. It just wouldn't. And so, anyways, we can move on, but just the construction unions to me serve zero bigger purpose outside of themselves getting good wages.
Right, and like
that, it's
yeah, and like you said, I mean,
incredibly destructive.
Right, and yeah, like we said, it's especially if they're existing in their own bubble where they're looking out for just, you know, a certain very select group of it. You know, so if they're, you know, for example, they're pushing for a more high-rise construction because that might benefit them, but you know, the greater community and society less so. So even then, like unions can't just be seen as like little, you know, rational agent entities competing on an open market like neoclassical fantasy agents, but have to be, you know, plugged into a larger metabolically conscious, you know, socius with taking into account not only people who work there, but suppliers, buyers, the surrounding communities, and, you know, larger environmental situations. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all this talk about the union, and it's yeah, I mean, there's a somewhat a diversity of unions here in the US, but I do find it quite ridiculous, the sort of Jacobin magazine attempt to draw these kind of intellectual and cultural connections between contemporary unions and socialist politics, or just like the contemporary process of just thinking that like that is a means to an end, to the end of socialism, because it's most certainly not. It's a means to subsisting a little bit better within capitalism, and that's it. But yeah, anyway, I guess, I mean, I found the conclusion of this essay quite powerful and interesting. I thought maybe we could move on to the conclusion, because they really state they sort of they have three, they say critical theory, or better, communist theory, proposing renaming critical theory communist theory. They say it has three tasks. The first task is sort of an inductive examination of class struggle as it exists in the present, and they say we should examine class struggle as itself theoretically productive. The point here is not to cheerlead struggles, but rather to read them, focusing on how they confront the composition problem and attempt to solve it via the haphazard construction of new categories, new tactics, and new organizational forms which resonate across society. So, I mean, we've talked a bit about that, about, you know, contemporary movements and how they manifest themselves. So they say the first task is to just study those movements and try to read them. The second task, they say, is to examine the forms of the unfolding crisis of capitalist social relations. So that's more the crisis theory that they're talking about when they, in sort of the more political economic dimension of this paper. And then the third, which I find them sort of very intriguing, they say the task is to gesture towards a communist future. And this is sort of a more abstract or deductive method compared to the first two. And it's kind of just, you know, mapping out what communism would entail, what breaking with capitalism would entail. And they say there's these abstract guidelines like breaking the index between social labor input and your ability to consume. That's sort of a abstract deductive kind of, you know, precondition for communism, right? And they say a few other things. They talk about how capitalist technology is not neutral, nor is the infrastructure which makes the use of that technology possible. Suburban divisions, electrical grids connected to coal-fired power plants. The material organization of social life today fits humanity into specific social grooves from which it must escape. How would an emancipated humanity use technology and design infrastructure? I found all of those questions very provocative. Yeah. And those tasks I found, I mean, can anyone think of any other tasks for kind of, you know, or does that feel complete? Those three tasks?
Well, I thought the idea is to never think in terms of completion.
Right.
I mean, I think the second task is I mean, they're all important and good, but the second task is really crucial, you know, because it kind of keeps coming back to what we talk about of simply like, you know, kind of freeing ourselves from rigid definitions and rigid categories and rigid and the frameworks that have been naturalized and universalized and historicized, and, you know, to just kind of first, you know, get the to reclaim the freedom to break free of the grooves that we've been put in. I think that part you read comes from that. Oh no, it comes from the third task. But yeah, it's a nice line. The specific social grooves from which it must escape. Yeah, the idea of social grooves and breaking free of those is certainly something that we've talked about in a lot of our groups. You know, the tyranny of categorization, and in this case, the capital labor relation as something that we don't want to just kind of make it nicer, more even, or more equal, but to re-examine it as not the only possible relation of person to person in society, even though it's been so strongly naturalized.
I agree, and I wanted to mention that I read this essay by Adorno recently that just covers on that marginalia on theory and praxis, and I would love to suggest that for the maybe not the value theory, but a separate one, just like the way in which one informs the other. And then, I mean, you know, he was not the most praxis oriented subject, right, for many reasons, but he was like mostly he made a comparison that praxis without theory or observation or analysis on what you're contending against is like a beaver. I mean, he mentions different like industrious enterprises that will fail at some degree, or like are like yeah. Yeah, totally. But I mean, just like comparing it to like a task that is like wonderful, but it has a limitation that again, like he mentioned Marx's beautiful metaphor about the architect and the V, and like just like the imagination of what the possible outcome might be, right? And then he mentioned that the and he, I think he doesn't even advocate for the, but like the academic apparatus states as I haven't read it, but let's read it. No, that, I mean, just to the last part of the essay, he was saying too that like Marx was trying to compose this critique of political economy, and just like trying to examine what the other side is saying and how things work materially, right? And that broke through the like bourgeois logic that everything, that great ideas are leading the world, and that everything's a response to such. And just, yeah, I'm interested to hear about your Leninist perspective, if, or like your reading political, but yeah, okay, yeah, basically that. But I just love the ending of that essay, and I think I have it in here, and it was just that and this, I think, again, it's like not only exclusive to the academic apparatus that like rejoices on being a theoretical examiner, because observation of the of what they're contending against happens in many indigenous movements and many like marginalized groups in society, because they have the ability to fully contemplate through a critical gaze. And so he says to the end of the essay, yeah, so Marx by no means surrendered himself to praxis. Praxis is a source of power for the theory, but cannot be prescribed by it. And then, oh, and then here, it appears in theory merely, and indeed necessarily, as a blind spot, as an obsession with that, with what is being criticized. And I think that's like your observation will inform enough to have already a way to tackle the hydra. And you're so it's like not to, and they mentioned this too in the essay, in the conclusion, to not shy away from one observes the split between, on the one hand, the activists who act without thinking, and the critical theorists who think without acting. Theory should allow for a thinking in action, one which knows the limits of action, yet acts nevertheless. I mean, that's a wonderful, what? To don't know. Rodrigo, do you want to contribute? You don't have to, but if you want to turn on the mic.
I know, yeah, it was just, I mean, yeah, I don't think I have much to add. I think yours are great points on which to, you know, on which to reflect. Mine was just about that point number, that second task, about, but I think I forgot what I wanted to say. I think it was around that in relation to, I can't really remember. I think it was about how, yeah, this issue about categorization and how the task of theory is also to appreciate, to not to appreciate, but to engage with, and to yeah, in conversation with how forms of organizing, of building autonomy, kind of prefigure social relations that overcome that unity in separation that in a way plagues all forms of organizing within unions, for example, about different sectors and coming together, but always one section prevailing, or or even if there is unity within one union, there is so much of that separation from other categories of workers, while in building autonomy and in social reproduction struggles, whether organizing for disaster, and often I'm thinking of anti-poverty movements and welfare action groups of which I'm part. In there, I feel that that issue of unity separation does not exist, precisely because we are totally opposed to any form of organizing life and making life disposable that is born of capitalism. So that so I feel that social reproduction struggles kind of prefigure and enough ways of transcending unity and separation and really coming together and yeah, making things happen. Yeah, not in unity, but that connecting ways of supporting each other in a ways where that unity is not needed. Yeah, so I feel that the task of theory is also engaging with that as a different way of organizing life.
Yeah, I think I agree, and the fact that theory has this like terrible connotation that it's only accessible to this elite, and in fact it's like this myth that it's perpetuated in the same academic apparatus, that only a certain amount of like chosen, incredibly intelligent people can discern it, and the language is not always accessible, and still like what is it basing its experience on but like the material things that we can relate to. And I think, I mean, and I think that's what they're advocating at the end of the essay, for that, for the constant engagement in both. And I think theory doesn't have to be static and stagnant, but could be just, I think it's just the examination. In that essay on Adorno, he mentions like we probably know of the accounts on the first revolts against the claims of property from different societies, based on someone that examined and consider what could happen, to the degree that, you know, it's that to me is like the epitome of theory, that part of like someone is considering, observing, being critical, and like that's why, I mean, critical theory in many countries it was just for so long a euphemism for Marxism, right? Like when in places like where there was a Red Scare, they would use that or hide under different fields, right? Sorry, I thought you wanted to say something, but maybe not. Yeah. So no, I mean, I do agree though that there needs to be more action coming from, and I have mentioned it with Brian a lot too, that for example, in the US, who is, you mentioned it, right, Brian, that who is actually doing mutual aid and helping and out there? It's never the Marxist theories, right? Mm.
Well, and I think that brings back to something Alex really struck me as thinking of like building trust, right? And saying like, yes, it's important to, and I think that's incredibly important, and to come up with plans and to analyze how they worked, and to another in completely different situations and adapt. But also like none of these things are going to work without trust among people, right? Like, so building that, I think in some ways it's really hard to do, I think Dan, you had said how building trust in like community can be really hard, and I think that's absolutely true. I also think it's something contagious, you know, like it can start out small or something, and very, very quickly you can build really close bonds with people. You know, a couple days ago, I think it's, and also when you have that bond, then you don't need to be necessarily completely convinced of an idea for organizing or something, right? If you're with someone you trust, you're
I think your Wi-Fi cut out, Brian.
willing to contribute to push their idea, even if you're like, yeah, I don't know if it's actually going to work. But when you're with somebody that you feel ties into what Mariano is still cutting out.
Yeah, it's stuck. You're kind of glitching in and out. Yeah, I had one thing to say about Ariana's comment about, you know, the process of breaking that unity in separation, and I said this a little bit earlier, and I'll phrase it a slightly different way, but like, I mean, there's two things. One, we don't really have enough time to build that, and I don't even know if it could be built in certain large swaths of the world in time for the kind of catastrophe that we're going to be facing. I think I have more faith in overcome the unity and separation being overcome in the process of social strife and potentially, you know, revolution itself, as opposed to being something that's like built before and then used as a platform. I mean, that's not to say that it shouldn't be attempted to be built before, but I don't have too much faith in this like two-stage process of building and then transitioning. I think it's more of a that the breaking of that unity and separation is something that will have to, you know, experimentally emerge in many different ways. It's not going to be one thing around the world. But certain tactics that are useful for breaking that unity and separation will resonate and spread, they say. So yeah, I guess there's just that different way of different ways of looking at revolution. And so is revolutionary capacity something you build before, whether it's in the form of, you know, grassroots or in the form of a hierarchical party, or is it something we have to kind of have hope will emerge in the process itself? I lean more towards the second side of that, but it's not to say, yeah, again, that building as much as you can to be ready for the catastrophe is extremely important. I think Alex said that in the chat earlier, and I fully agree with that. And that means both mental and physical capacities, you know?
Right. But building in advance, it can't become the mindset that there's a certain amount we have to build before we're ready. You know?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's all I'm getting at.
Right. Yeah.
Alex, please.
Yeah, like also something that I want to put there as well is this idea of the trust is needed, not only because it's great to trust each other, and that would eventually help us to have more resilient movements and organizations or ways of organizing. But there's also this part of lack of community accountability. And I don't want to start like another discussion on this, but I was thinking about something Juvia mentioned before that had to do with some of these patriarchal structures. And I think that some of the times when we analyze past movements or past ways in which people organize towards justice, for example, we see how as there was a lack of accountability, then some of patriarchal structures, sexist structures, racist structures also permeated into the movements. And I think that for understanding this complexity of community accountability and trust building, the people working on the transformative justice movement have done lots of really amazing work on trying to set some of their, well, not setting, but mostly sharing their experiences they've had, trying to assess some issues that, of course, they can present when you're trying to build a movement towards justice or even to transform these hideous capitalist agendas that are part of the world we're trying to inhabit. But yeah, I just wanted to mention them because for me, the work they've been doing, particularly in the United States, has been very hopeful, facing sometimes how difficult it is to have discussions inside different movements or activist spaces when it comes to, assess gender-based violence, for example.
Dan dropped out a second. Oh, thanks for coming, Ariana. She's already gone.
I too will have to go in a few minutes at
Yeah,
Me too.
o'clock.
yeah. I need to get back to work and also eat something. I'm starving.
Yeah. So I guess we probably won't decide right now what we want to read next, but we'll definitely, maybe over that email thread, we can throw out some. I saw you mention a couple things, Mike.
Yeah, I'd like to suggest if you want to get back into theory, like, back to, Deleuze and Masumi type space, I've just been kind of thumbing through a little bit of the beginning of Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange and Death. And, and to get really back to the heart of value theory and continuation of the interpretations of Marxian theory of value, a lot of fun stuff there. I figured, like, if I put that forward, and I can moderate that, maybe it's just the preface in chapter 1, about 50 pages, 40 pages. I found a PDF online. I'll throw a link in there. Maybe not next time, but in the future. Yeah, I think it's, from what I've checked out, it connects with a lot of what we've been talking about, both in terms of theory and praxis, although this would be real French theory again, if we have the stomach for that. and then more poetry. Sorry, Brecht. I don't know if that was this group or another group, but I'm all for that as well.
Yeah. I also say that we wait to finalize it until email, because that way we won't forget to do it in email again.
Yeah. Cool.
But this was great. Thank you everyone for showing up. This was really enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. And now we've got some good endnotes readings under our belts at this point.
Yeah.
So yeah, we could move on to something else. And
of course, down the line, the new Heinrich, right?
Oh yeah, I got the book, my hands on the book, and I read it already, but I would reread it.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm yet to, but it's definitely on my list.
Let me know when you get it.
Thanks, Alex, for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Yes,
and it was fun.
for sure.
Everyone else.
It's great.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time.
See you guys.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Yeah.